All right, thank you, Oliver, for that introduction, and thank you to Cynthia for inviting me here today. It's really a pleasure to have the chance to share this research with you. Let me know if you can't hear me. Sometimes that happens. Again, I work for the National Housing Conference. We are America's oldest affordable housing advocacy organization. We were actually founded here in New York back in 1931 by a coalition of affordable housing developers and social workers, led by Mary Simkovich, who was, among other things, a founder of an organization called Greenwich House that you may know. We were originally the National Public Housing Conference, and we've sort of evolved as housing has evolved and as the need for affordable housing has evolved. Part of our evolution is the Center for Housing Policy. We started that organization and kind of spun it off in 1992 to look at how different housing policies are working around the country. And what can we learn from the best practices that we see in cities around the U.S. We just brought the center back into the fold at the end of the year and end of last year, and so we're now one organization, and so we work on policy, we work on research and communications to support organizations and people like you in the work that you do. So my colleague Robert Hickey and I, Robert was unable to be here today. He's got a big deadline looming, but he and I were part of a research team that looked at different ways that communities in the US and in Canada were building community acceptance. We were put together to help the city of Edmonton deal with some community acceptance issues around affordable and supportive housing. So Robert and I looked at success stories in 10 different cities around the U.S. We were really looking for what were key themes, what were the things that were successful sort of across the board in communities. And we looked at affordable housing generally and supportive housing, but we were focusing more on the supportive housing element. So this is the list of the case study locations. As you can see, we sort of hit the coasts, and Cynthia was very helpful in our research as well, and that's where some of our information about New York came from. So first of all, the community concerns that we found, I think, are concerns that you have run into in your work. It's the typical stuff. Folks were often concerned that there would be poor management and that would help crime happen and decrease property values. They were afraid that higher-end development wouldn't be possible anymore after this housing was developed. Folks are afraid of services being overloaded. Too many new kids in schools, the roads would be too packed. Other city services would be overused by all of these new people. And the design of the building, the size of the building would change their community too much and make it a place that they didn't want to live anymore. So it's that kind of it's fear of change and fear of the unknown and concern about financial impact on themselves, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you. And of course, in the supportive housing cases that we looked at, there was that additional overlay of concern about the people themselves who were going to be living in those developments once they were built. So one of the things that I think is a little bit different about the way that we looked at citing issues and building community acceptance is that we really saw a role both for the city, the jurisdiction, and for the developer itself. And of course, there are a lot of good things that I'm sure all of you are doing as if you are developers to try to build community acceptance. But I think we sometimes forget about the potential role of the city to really set the tone and create a framework. One of the things that struck me in doing this research, particularly because we were working with a lot of folks from Canada, is that their perspective on all of this was a jurisdictional perspective. They'd asked us to do jurisdictional reviews. And from our perspective, what we wanted to be looking at and what made sense to look at was a single developer who'd worked on a single development and the process they'd gone through to gain acceptance for it in the community. But from the Canadian perspective, it seemed like there was a lot more that the cities were doing, or there was an expectation that there was really the city involvement. And it got me thinking a lot about the way we build housing and create opportunity for people who need affordable housing or who are exiting homelessness in this country. And it's really all about public policy goals that are set by your city, by your state, by your county, and then we ask nonprofits, for-profits, non-governmental or quasi-governmental, in the case of public housing authorities, organizations, to carry that out. And so it's an interesting split, and I think that folks in communities end up seeing the developer as being the one who's coming in and trying to make all these changes and maybe trying to mess things up in the community, when really what they're doing is trying to be part of serving this greater goal that's been set by the elected officials who folks in that community probably voted for. So I think if we sort of think about it this way and see how there are those dual roles, we can sort of do a little bit of a better job in building community acceptance and doing the education that we need to do. So first I'll talk a little bit about government role, and I'll talk a little bit about the developer role after that, and you'll hear, I think, in a lot more and maybe even better detail from Michelle and Cynthia about that end. But to begin with, on the government role, what we found is that in the communities where the city had done a really thorough job of educating the public in an ongoing way about housing policy goals, about what they were doing with funding for housing, developments were a lot more successful because people in communities already understood that some of this was going on. So there's a lot that a city government or a county government can do. There's an ongoing education effort that can be done in a multimedia way on websites, through public meetings. Sure, we like it when developers host tours and have public openings of developments, but that's something that governments can be a part of as well. And it can be in a comprehensive way, so you can show this is a housing development that we funded, this is a school that's related to it, or this is a community center that's related to it. This is how we've worked to help this entire community, and supportive housing is just a part of it. And then we saw government officials participating in public meetings and in community meetings where new developments were being discussed. So they were out front, part of the process, as much as developers were, in explaining this is why this is happening, this is why this is important for the community. So the government can also create a supportive structure for review and for decision making around affordable and supportive housing development. Again, having a clear plan and a clearly publicized process for how and why this housing is being built in communities is really important. I don't know how much this is relevant in New York City or in New York State, but in a lot of cities, it's CDCs, community development corporations, that are doing a lot of the housing development. And the purpose of the CDC is to build something for the community and meet a variety of community needs, including housing. And so if that's something that's really active in a community, then what folks are seeing is that sort of community focus, right? They're not seeing the greater goals around supportive housing, for example, that a city or a state might have. And so they don't necessarily know when a developer is coming to them with a proposal, they don't necessarily understand why they're not being asked for a significant amount of input or that kind of thing. And so making clear that this is part of not just a neighborhood or a community, but this is part of city and state goals is important and helpful. And then in the process itself, there's a lot that the city can do. In a couple of cases, particularly in Sunnyvale, California. The city actually sat down with the developer once they were in the, I think once they were funded, and sat down with them and helped them develop their public education process. So right from the beginning, they were there to help the developer figure out who were the important people to talk to, how should this go, what are the parameters. And then in terms of parameters themselves, we saw sort of a number of different ways that cities sort of set the regulations. In San Francisco and Seattle, it is required for supportive housing development or for development that receives certain kinds of funding, the developer has to go through a set process. And in some cities, it's a little bit less clear. It's encouraged to have a community engagement process, but it's not required. And what we saw is that in places where there was a set process that was clear and everyone knew what their role was, what the time frame was, and why they were engaging, that's where the process was the most effective. It's important for everyone to know what their role is, when and how and why they can weigh in, and for there to be ground rules. The City of Seattle Consolidated Plan has a very clear section about how this engagement is supposed to go, the required engagement. They make clear that no request for funding is going to be turned down on the basis of neighborhood opposition. They spell out the roles that community members have in terms of listening and understanding, and also providing feedback and helping educate a developer about the needs of the community. And there are sort of guidelines for the developer as well. And in that section, it also reiterates the city's non-discrimination policies to make it clear and have it set out on paper for anyone to look at that this isn't going to be a discriminatory process, and that there are limits to what community input can actually influence. Of course, I lived in Seattle for 10 years, and only when I was doing this research did I actually look at the consolidated plan. So it's not like, you know, the average citizen is going to be cracking that open on a Sunday morning with coffee and learning about what the city thinks that you should be saying when you go to a community meeting. But the point is that anyone who's involved in the process, whether it's someone who's a city official or a developer or a community member, can look at that or be shown that and see, okay, there are limits, or these are the boundaries, or this is where I should be weighing in. It provides a framework in sort of a non-political way. Then, speaking of depoliticizing the process, we saw a few different ways that funding decisions are made or reviewed, and it seemed that in the cases where it was an anonymous bureaucrat in a city office who was making the final decision about who's going to get the money and whether or not they're going to get the money and whether or not the development is going to happen, that's where the process was more successful, because when it's an elected official, maybe an appointed body where some folks are elected, have other elected roles, and some folks are community members, for example, those elected officials are going to be the ones who are hearing significant comment from community members, and they have a responsibility, right, to their constituents. And their tendency is going to be to at least want to make decisions based on what their constituents are telling them, not on those housing policies that have been set out. But if you have a bureaucrat in place who's looking at the requirements and checking off the boxes and making sure that everything lines up, your process is going to be a little bit more fair. Another thing we saw was government making really useful connections for developers and for community members. So a city government can do a lot to help developers understand who are the people in a community who they need to speak with in order to quell early opposition and build alliances that are going to be helpful down the line. And again, this is the kind of thing that if this really is a policy goal that the city is committed to, this is a way to affirmatively support housing development by being there in the beginning and supporting the developer as they go through the process. Another thing that I think was really important in a lot of cases was that the government officials were showing up at the meetings that the developers were holding, and it wasn't just the guy from the housing office. It was someone from the parks department and someone from the water department and someone from the transportation division, and bringing sort of the whole group of folks together who were in some way involved in the situation. And one of the things that I don't know if this is unique about the United States, but in general, I think we're a little bit detached as a public from how things work in our city governments. And we're also not, unless there's something that's really personal happening in our community, something we really think is going to affect us, we're not spending our evenings at community meetings. We're not going to the 15-minute one-on-one conversations that our council members offer to us every year, that kind of thing. This might be the only time that some of these folks have had a one-on-one opportunity with their government, or have even really thought about how any of this happens in their community. And so this is really a PR opportunity, honestly, for government. It's a way to be there, answer people's questions, and help out those folks who maybe were hoping that they could get a park along with this new development or that kind of thing, to help answer their questions and show that they're really engaged and involved and interested beyond just making sure that this project happens. In the city of Portland, we looked at Home Forward, which is the Portland Housing Authority. We looked at a couple of their developments, and one of them was a redevelopment of I think they built the housing in the 40s or 50s, very early on. They were redeveloping the whole thing, and it abutted a wooded area that the Housing Authority didn't own. But one of the major things that the community hoped to get out of this redevelopment was trails through that wooded area. And of course, that was completely outside of the scope of what Home Forward was able to do, because they didn't even own the land. It's certainly not something that they had financing for, but they were able to bring the city in and sort of extend that conversation a little bit. And that satisfies the needs and the interests of the people in the community outside of this supportive housing that's being developed. So on to the developer role, and I'm sure a lot of this will be familiar to you and is probably part of some of your work. So the folks who are successful engaged early, they engaged often, and they engaged strategically. We got a great quote from one of the folks we talked to in Novato, California, which is in Marin County, a very wealthy and sort of more conservative area near Oakland. Never underestimate the value of a cup of coffee or tea. Have those conversations with people one-on-one, early on, before any decisions have been made, and show that goodwill and build those relationships early. Another thing that we heard, of course, was that the best way to show that all of these fears that people have aren't going to come true is by building the development and having it be a good addition to the community. Since we can't time travel, what we can do is hold tours of properties that you've already developed, or that are similar to what you're looking at putting in the community, and include other sort of ongoing education efforts as a part of your work. So just as for the city government, this shouldn't just be something that they're starting to talk to the community about when a new development is about to happen. You should be, as a developer, you should be speaking in the community and maintaining a presence even when you're not about to build something new. Holding project meetings, holding meetings for your new proposed development at existing properties is a great way of inviting the community in and showing them what it's going to be like once it's once it's built. And then we saw a lot of different approaches to holding the community meetings. The open mic situation where you bring 200 or 300 people into a room and set a microphone down in the middle of it and invite people to line up, that's the least successful way, for the most part, based on the case studies that we did, to engage people. As I'm sure you've seen, this is the easiest way to get the folks who are the most oppositional, the most dramatic, and the people who are going to have the tendency to incite others. And there are a lot of other ways that we can have legitimate and serious and meaningful engagement with members of our communities without putting the microphone in the middle of the room. Poster sessions, design charrettes, small group conversations, one-on-one meetings, putting some time into organizing the conversation is helpful, I think, to quiet the histrionics, but honestly also to create an environment where people who maybe aren't quite as bold or aren't comfortable speaking in public have an opportunity to participate, because we really do want to get input, as well as just making sure things don't get out of hand. One of the things that community members across the board seem to be really concerned about is making sure that they knew who to talk to about problems, and that they had some sense that the developer and the city and the management were going to take a high level of responsibility even after this whole process was over. So having some way of letting the community know if there's an issue, this is who you contact. In some cases, we saw good neighbor agreements used for that. In fact, Home Forward in Portland really saw good neighbor agreements as, I think they were required to do one for a supportive development in downtown Portland. They really saw that as sort of being the only real purpose for the good neighbor agreement was just to have sort of a communications process set out there. I have some thoughts about good neighbor agreements that I'm not including in this presentation, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to discuss. And the other thing folks want to know is, what's going to happen when the money runs out and you disappear? And it's unfortunate that this is how people think, but I think years of sort of iffy government, to be honest, has created this idea in a lot of people's heads that, the money's going to disappear and you're not going to be able to keep operating anymore. So I think this is a situation where both the developer and the city and the jurisdiction need to be giving assurances and having a clear plan for how management is going to happen. So flexibility within reason seemed to work. So in Arlington County, Virginia, at this point, there's not a whole lot of freestanding supportive housing only development happening. They've been building supportive housing into other larger 100% affordable units or developments. And they've found that this is a lot more successful in terms of, to be honest, sort of hiding the fact that there's going to be some supportive housing. What the community ends up concentrating on is the development as a whole. They're not paying attention to those 10 units where people are going to be receiving services. This doesn't work everywhere, but it's something that you might be able to consider. Another thing that we saw was a developer effort to use common areas and retail spaces for community needs. In Philadelphia, the developer was building in an area that I think, it was one of those business districts that was just coming back. The community was really concerned that it was fragile and really wanted to make sure that there was going to be enough commercial and retail space in the community. And so the developer was speaking to the community early enough in their plans that they were able to make some adjustments. They had initially planned to have offices in their first floor space, and so they said, okay, this is a concern, so we're going to move the offices up to a higher floor. We're going to put retail on the ground floor. DESC in Seattle, they actually structure their financing so that the retail space in their developments doesn't need to generate revenue in order for them to be a going concern. And this allows them to work with the community and bring in different kinds of retail or other resources that the community really needs. DESC works with some of the, I think, hardest to house people, a lot of people who have been on the street for a significant amount of time, and they sort of stand out in Seattle for that. And I think they've made some good sort of PR inroads, but they also find themselves needing to make a lot of concessions like this. And they're fairly careful about it, but in the example that we looked at, again, it was another one of those sort of fledgling retail areas and a part of the city where there were relatively few places to get fresh produce. And so DESC brought in a CSA, a community-supported agriculture organization that had never had a storefront before. They were just sort of a go pick up a box of vegetables once a week type operation. But DESC is working with them to open their first retail space in this new development. And of course, they've never done this before. They have no idea if this CSA is going to work as a retail space. But because DESC doesn't need the revenue from that space, it's something that they're able to do. Then another thing that we saw was considering some size and design changes that the community was interested in. And of course, this gets tricky too, because if you get too small, then you can't build the building anymore. But some changes in height, some changes in orientation of the building can be helpful. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. And thank you for your attention.
Why don't you stay there for a second, and we'll ask you a couple questions. I thought that was terrific. Very, very informative, Amy. Thank you. I was wondering, did the developers you looked at, were community preferences involved in any of the developments, and did you find those to be a positive way of dealing with community opposition? Or
community preferences in terms of?
For tenants. In other words, members of the neighborhood would get a first preference in occupancy.
No, that's not something that I recall having come up in any of in fact, the cases that I think we looked at least the view of the community was that those folks didn't live there already, whether or not that was actually the case. So that didn't come in, at least in the conversations we had.
Okay. I was also wondering, it was interesting that you said in the sort of the role of bright lines for structuring conversation. Like in Seattle, they say clearly community opposition to a project is not going to affect the financing or lack thereof, which seems like a very good idea. But at the same time, obviously, government generally feels like they should, and one of their roles is to be responsive, right, to the community and their concerns. So I'm wondering, how did you see that sort of conflict addressed? How did city officials still appear, and how were they, in fact, still responsive on these issues, while at the same time not being, not giving a veto power to the community?
Sure. So in the Seattle case, there was actually a city council member who was supportive of one of the developments that DESC was working on, but she, wanted to balance the community concerns, and so she actually, even though it wasn't required, she asked DESC to enter into a good neighbor agreement with the community. And so, I mean, honestly, adding another layer of obligation sort of seemed to be the way that that was dealt with. So it's, no, community member, you can't turn this project away, but we can add more assurances that things are going to be managed in a way that's going to make this development an okay part of the neighborhood.
Thank you. So I was curious, were there any, I thought I'd heard that Portland had a policy whereby they insisted that special needs housing developers meet with communities, but that there be a mediator and that would be paid for by the city of Portland, and that it be structured in a certain way. I was wondering if you saw any examples of ways in which the city actually structured the conversation, the actual meetings of the minds.
I don't recall that from the case in Portland. We talked with them a little bit about Bug Clark Commons, which was one of the Home Forward's most recent supportive developments, and they were more focused on their sort of community acceptance coalition, something like that. They bring together these big, broad groups of community members as a part of the design process, and they were much more focused on that than the meetings themselves. But that's something that I can certainly look into.